There is one story that comes to mind that really opened my eyes as far as fires and the damage that fires can cause. It occurred when I was in Florida on the Apalachicola National Forest, and at that time I was a deputy district ranger, and we had a wildfire that was there, and not sure if many people are around, but Florida experienced some severe drought in the late 1990s, 1998, 1999, and I was there during that time. And the behavior was way different. In Florida, normally there's a lot of prescribed burning that goes on, and so normally you would set a prescribed burn. Normally what it would do when it would go into an area that was really moist or maybe a swamp, the fire would go out. Well, during this time period, at least 1999 when I was there, we had one that it behaved way differently. We thought the prescribed burn had gone out. About 2 or 3 weeks later, it started to smolder, got enough wind, got enough fuel, and it turned into a wildfire. And during that time of it being a wildfire, was really conscious and thinking about the impacts to the Tallahassee airport. So the Apalachicola is just south of Tallahassee, the state capital. So we were worried about smoke, in the direction of smoke, with shutting down the airport. We were also really concerned about the smoke with maybe shutting down Interstate 10. Interstate 10 also goes right through Tallahassee heading west. And so during that time, we had called in some fire resources. We had called in some different fire teams. And I remember one afternoon, the fire behavior changed drastically. And I was up in a helicopter just taking a look at the fire with a helicopter pilot. And during that time, the fire was beginning to threaten some different communities. We were trying to evacuate people, but the flames were coming out of the tops of the trees. The trees were about 110 feet tall, and the flames were probably 150 feet going into the sky, embers flying everywhere. And it scared me. It scared me because it was really, really close to some communities. Fire behavior was extremely extreme, and I thought we were going to lose a community. And that situation stuck with me throughout all my career, whether we were doing prescribed burns or whether or not we were dealing with wildfires. It helped me just to realize that potential always exists. And for us, trying to manage natural resources, it's our responsibility to do the very best we can to try to protect communities, people, critical infrastructure that we have. So that would be probably the one that resonates as far as just an example. And I was a deputy ranger, and so at that time I was the responsible official. And so the decisions that we make to either do a prescribed burn, order a team, it totally changed my priorities, and it really changed the way I looked at fire. So if it's in a general forest somewhere and there's not communities around, that's no big deal maybe. But when you're threatening communities and burning up homes, and whether or not you're going to shut down the airport or make it really difficult for planes to take off and land, or the possibility of smoking in an interstate and people not see, and you cause a pileup on the interstate, it really changes the way you think about coming at these issues. And so I've always had that as a reminder, and I've always tried to be really involved with fire, trying to be involved with the decisions, because I know it can have a lot of negative effects. So we had a lot of fire resources, and so we were using, if people have seen it, we were using aircraft with retardant. We were using helicopters with buckets, dropping water on what we call hot spots, like individual smokes. And so we're doing that, and then we were breaking the fuel up. We had bulldozers and hand crews, so we were removing the brush and the fuel so it could be buried dirt to help stop the fire. And ultimately, what put the fire out altogether was rain, and it took a while, but ultimately that was what put everything totally out. So we had tried our very best to make the community safe, making it safe to get people in and out, widening the lines, like I say, using retardant and water drops, putting out the hot spots. All of those things were helpful, but eventually the thing that really put everything out, eliminated all the smoke, all the fire that was kind of burning in the ground, burning out, roots that were in the ground, was the rain. Believe it or not, I think maybe at that time, and it's kind of hard to remember all of the details, but I think there might have been either a change in the fuel type, or there might have been a change in the wind. And then at the same time, we were using aircraft to drop retardant on the fuel too, to help take the oxygen away from the fire. So those things in combination really played a huge part. And ultimately, no homes were lost. But boy, I'm telling you what, the threat was extremely high. I had done prescribed burning before. I had always been taking a part of prescribed burning. But that was, I think, the first time for me, and I was a decision maker. That was my first decision making position in the Forest Service. And to think about being responsible for, one, making a decision whether or not you do a prescribed burn or not, makes a really big difference. And you think about the resources that you bring in for fire and being engaged and involved. But ultimately, had that community burned, I'd imagine there probably was been some fingers or my decision making ability, or how I manage things might have come into question. But it was the first time, like, wow, I'm the person that made the decision on some of these decisions to do this, and that really helps bring things home. A lot of people talk about accountability. Being involved is not the same thing as being accountable. For me, accountability is at the end of the day, if things go to hell in a handbasket, you're the person that has to deal with the repercussions of that. You're the person that's on the news, or you're the person in the news media, or you're the one that have to go tell people about some decisions you've made. So not only dealing with fire, but it made a really big difference for me, with other decisions that I would make during my career in the Forest Service. It made me realize that I needed to own my decisions, which meant if there was something that I didn't know a lot about, I would learn about it before I made a decision about it. Looks like going from there to where we are now, and it's pretty big. So we got a pretty large landscape in California. And if you look at it with just the overall mass and the size of California, if you look at it in its entirety, it can be overwhelming. So if you look at a map, California, if you were to try to compare California to the East Coast, California is like going from Florida to Maryland. You think about how big of a land base, or how many different states that's there. So really big landscape, 40 million people. How do you deal with it? So for me, is being able to think about, of all these places that are really special, that have value on the landscape, let's identify those, and then let's work at our very best to try to make those safe. So for instance, you think about the highway system like 299 or Highway 36 or Highway 44, as those roads traverse and go through different communities. Let's do fuels work to reduce the amount of fuel that are along those state highways that lead to communities, right? And so with a lot of fires occurring along roads, hopefully if we do a really good job of focusing our attention on those state highways, maybe there may be fires, but the size and magnitude may change. So roads would be one. utility corridors. There are fires that occur there. So maybe you widen the fuels underneath the power lines, and maybe even you do work outside of what we call the right of way. And so, you might do that a couple 100 feet or 100 feet outside of the right of way as a way to try to help reduce the impact of fire. You do stuff around communities. Maybe you work to make the fuel a lot less around a quarter mile around communities as another one. So for me, let's focus on the people places, the places where, we've got infrastructure, we know where people live, and communities. Let's make it safe to get them in and out, and then let's protect critical infrastructure. So not only just the utilities, but in some places in the state, in the Sierras, water is still moved by wood. In the canal, not the canal system, but maybe it's the canal. I forgot the terminology for that. But there's water that's still being moved by wood. And so the chances are, if you've got a fire in the forest and if it burns those structures, then now what you've lost the ability to move water. So that needs to be included as well. So for me at this point in time, just thinking about who are those different entities that are a part of the landscape, and then how can we work together to put our resources together in those places called people places. So you got the United States Forest Service in California. You've got the Bureau of Land Management. You've got CAL FIRE, PG&E, Industrial Landowners, Caltrans, the California Fish and Wildlife Agency, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, Tahoe Conservancy, and then there's just so many more. The fire safe councils that exist up and down the state. And so for me is, how do we act together? And so if we've got projects that will ultimately reduce the amount of fuel on the ground, which ultimately will affect fire behavior or the severity of fires, is there a way for us to link those projects together so we can have a contiguous fuel break across the landscape? That's strategic. There's a huge land base that exists, but is there a way for us to be able to link those projects together that makes a difference? So that could be along ridges, bordering around communities, state highways, being able to reduce the fuels along state roads or highways or county roads, or places where are destination locations for people, and so if you think about it, think about the number of times you've gone down the road and you've seen people with flat tires, and you've seen people that have been driving their vehicles on the rims. Well, the rims on the road create sparks, or someone's dragging a chain and the chain is hitting the ground or the pavement, and that creates sparks. So what are those things, and where are those areas that we can work together to help reduce that, at the same time trying to educate the public about the severity of fire, and sometimes small things that we can do to make a difference. So when you think about all the different entities, all the different townships, all the state agencies, so many other federal agencies trying to work together, it is challenging. It takes a tremendous amount of work, takes a tremendous amount of communication and collaboration. But I do believe, particularly in California, that we've made a difference. And we've come together with a common issue. It's a wildfire crisis. We acknowledge that. We know it has impacts on climate change, impacts on air quality for people that might have asthma or other breathing conditions, health conditions, and ultimately, it makes a difference. And so, I think we've come together. We acknowledge that we've got this problem. We're coming at this problem. We're allocating resources, whether it's at the federal or state level, and then we're trying to come together to implement projects, which is ultimately the most important thing that we want to do. We want to implement projects. We want to work together. And, over time, I think it's going to make a difference. So this problem didn't just come about. It's been in existence for a while. And so it's not just one problem. So there's several aspects. So some decades ago, the Forest Service changed some of its policies about thinning out the forest. So during that time, the agency had a policy that you were really aggressive with being able to try to put fires out. And so in ecosystems where fire was natural, it changed that. And so, being aggressive to put the fires out, the harvest levels that the Forest Service used to do as well changed. So it was greatly reduced. And so now, in many places across the landscape, our forests are way thicker than what they used to be. So one issue is there's more trees on the landscape than what occurred naturally based on science. Another aspect is the climate has changed. So our climate, has gotten a lot hotter and drier, and so that makes it and has an effect on the vegetation. So when the fires burn, they burn a lot hotter. They destroy a lot more vegetation. Is another one. Another issue has been many people who have lived in cities. There's more and more people that are living out in suburban areas into the forested areas. So now, where you have a fire, the firefighters have to think about trying to protect structure and homes and get people in and out safely. Whereas in the past, generally in most places across the country, fire was in the backcountry. It was in the mountains. It was in remote areas. And so those are just a few things that has changed, I think, over time, that has made the wildfire situation a little tougher. Well, actually, a lot tougher here in the United States. Right now, in my opinion, there is something that exists that hadn't existed in a really long time. So, right now, the federal government, particularly the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, they have financial resources to come at this wildfire crisis. The state of California, and I'm going to only speak to California, and the state of California has also allocated tremendous amount of funds to be able to come at this issue. So in the past, it typically has been the amount of money that you need to bring on resources, hiring people to try to manage and deal with the fire. Another one is the resources for suppression. And, so that's another issue that existed. And so now there's a lot more money in order to be able to do the treatments that occur. And there's resources to be able to, for people to do the work as well. And something else that is just my observation over time. Normally when people have a lot of money and resources, there's not a lot of incentive to cooperate and work with your neighbors. And, for a long time, each different entity had its own policies, its own set of goals, own objectives. And if they've had enough money, there really wasn't much reason to work with your neighbor or another entity. I think that has drastically changed. Our problem is so big now that nearly all of us recognize that the resources that we do have, the people that we do have, let's use those as a system. Let's use those together and not just operate independently. So those are some of the challenges, but I also think too, and I'm really optimistic that our behavior has changed, where we're more collaborative and we want to communicate more and talk about places where are those priority places that we want to protect. And then we also talk about what resources do each of us have to bear to be able to come at that problem. And so that's really exciting. It's challenging. It's really challenging when you think about all the people that need to come together and talk and have conversations. Sometimes there's a lot of disagreements on maybe where or the way you might treat a problem. But I think the conversations and the energy that we have now, we're really starting to overcome that. We got a ways to go, but I think we're on the right path.